Now, for the rest of the hour, we are honored to have Alex-Abella on the radio broadcast with us. He's a New York Times notable book author, Emmy-nominated TV reporter, and screenwriter. Alex-Abella is the author of Soldiers of Reason, the R.A.N.D. Corporation, the American Empire, a study of the world's most influential think tank, published by Harcourt. Alex was the first journalist to have full access to R.A.N.D's files in Santa Monica, California, and they did not like the response that they got when the book came out. They did not like the results. Abella's nonfiction work includes Shadow Enemies, a nonfiction account of a plot by Adolf Hitler. I've read about this, to start a wave of terror and destruction in the United States. Born in Cuba, Alex migrated with his family to the United States when he was age 10. And we really appreciate this accomplished researcher and writer and news reporter for joining us. alex-abella.com is his website. Alex, good to have you here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure. I was listening to your reports before. It's really scary what's going on.
Very suspicious, these shootings happening every time universities try to say that students can have concealed carry, and when they were having a prominent concealed carry person speaking at the law school tonight.
Amazing, amazing. You know, it's just like another step into, you know, the consolidation of the military-industrial complex, which is, you know, what came out of R.A.N.D. I mean, this is like, my book, it deals with the birthplace of the military-industrial complex. And it's funny, too, that in a way it took a former general, Eisenhower, to warn us against this, and, you know, and yet, you know, here we are, all these years later.
Well, for those that don't know, when you watch a movie like Dr. Strangelove made by Stanley Kubrick, they call it the R.A.N.D. Corporation,
right. Has
a report where they talk about we can nuke Russia and only lose 10 to 20 million Americans. That's really based, from my research, but I want you, who knows far more than I, on real reports put out by R.A.N.D. and some of these shadowy figures that started it. You've got the floor. Break down the history of R.A.N.D. and why it's so important.
Well, I think, you know, R.A.N.D. is important for a number of reasons. I mean, dating back, it's the most influential think tank in America, if not in the world. It shaped our policy of nuclear deterrence. It came up with a concept of counterinsurgency, laid the foundation for the Internet, was harbored game theory, came up with something called systems analysis, which revolutionized the U.S. government. But above all, the main thing that is really, really, really important, which is something that perhaps I should have emphasized even more in the book, but it's very clear there. They came up with a foundation for the wave of financial disasters that we find ourselves in, something called rational choice theory, which was developed by a Nobel Prize winner named Kenneth Arrow, who came up with something called Arrow's stratagem, which in a way went against the precepts of Marxism, and yet turned loose this whole wave of deregulation, of people just thinking that, you know, they're only in it for themselves, and like overturn all the concepts on which this country had been based on. That, I think, is their major contribution to, unfortunately, to our national fabric.
When you say it's the most influential think tank in the United States and probably the world, that is not an exaggeration. In fact, it may even be an understatement. From my research, Stanley Kubrick was obsessed with the R.A.N.D. Corporation, got a lot of the material for several of his films from it, because he realized that they were charting so much of our technological development and sat at the top of the capstone for the scientific and technological elite that Eisenhower talked about in his speech that were controlling the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower quotes about military-industrial complex being dangerous. You know, those are well known, but the rest of his farewell address gets into the scientific, technological elite that was taking over the system, because he was reading their reports. He was seeing what they had to say. Let's start at the beginning. Why did you want to look at R.A.N.D. Corporation? How were you able to get in to see their internal annals when no one else had been able to do it? And let's walk through all the different things that they developed, including, didn't they develop the idea for mid-air refueling?
Yes, absolutely. And also the idea of second nuclear strike deterrence. And that came out of something called a basing study, which highlighted the weaknesses in our national defense. system against a surprise strike by the Russians. Of course, never mind that the Russians, didn't have enough weapons to really do all this, but in any case, had they been able to, they would have been able to.
And not to mention, of course, they helped develop the current COG plan that Northcom uses to militarize and take over our entire society by building a second secretive government.
Well, I think you got a point right there. From the very beginning, R.A.N.D has been involved with people who have wanted to create an alternative, a secret government. I mean, for crying out loud, it's like one of the major givers of funds, the people who funded the organization, was the Ford Foundation, and its first president Guyver, who really believed, in a one-world government controlled by technocrats. I mean, it's really chilling when you go back and you realize, my God, this is the way that it's been going on since the late 1940s. It's amazing. And R.A.N.D came up, was developed in 1946 as an adjunct of the United States Air Force because there was a general named Hap Arnold who wanted to create the equivalent of the Manhattan Project. As you know, Manhattan Project was the one that came up with the atomic bomb. And what he wanted is that he wanted a combination of military and civilian scientists who would be able to come up with new weapons of destruction. Specifically, they were interested in intercontinental missiles. So they came up with the idea of having this outfit then that would receive money from the military, but actually would be a civilian thing, because he realized that most civilian scientists would not want to work under the strictures of the U.S. Armed Forces. So they set up R.A.N.D, which, by the way, the acronym, it means Research and Development. Of course, there's no development. It's always been research. In 1946, and it was housed at Douglas Aircraft here in Santa Monica, because the guy Mr. Douglas, happened to be married to Arnold's daughter. So, they were relations. In any case, they set it up here at Douglas Aircraft. And within a couple of years, R.A.N.D was doing so much work for the military that Douglas Aircraft, the company, felt that, its own livelihood was being endangered. So they had to spin it off. And then to spin it off, they went then to the Ford Foundation and to Wells Fargo Bank and got loans and got just outright gifts also from Henry Ford himself. And with that money, then they were able to set up and become independent as a place where they would develop, like new weapons of destruction. And it's been going on ever since. I mean, Bernard Brodie, who was the main, who's been called the father of nuclear deterrence, worked there for a while. And as I said, they developed systems analysis, which is a way of, of viewing problems in their context instead of just individually, and and seeing which is the best way to arrive at a result, but all numerically based.
Well, Mr. Abella, I want to go over the fact that they have, literally charted the militarization of police. I mean, almost every policy we see, they charted the course for that. But let's go back, because we're about to go to break. Let's go back to what you talked about, the Ford Foundation and its founder. Tell us about him. And they've had congressional hearings on this, where they openly want global government. I mean, when you actually go to the documents, that's what it says.
That's right.
And so let's talk about their master plan for the planet and what type of documents you saw when you were researching.
Well, the documents are all there. I mean, these things are not hidden, and these are public documents that you can see on which, Guyver, there's been a lot of research on this, in which Guyver, who was the first president of the Ford Foundation and who was one of the founders of the R.A.N.D Corporation, also, was an advocate of a one-world government. And so was John Williams, who was the intellectual powerhouse behind the R.A.N D Corporation. And John Williams, who was the mathematician, he advocated nuking the Soviet Union, and then again forming, a one-world government that would be again ruled by technocrats. So it's been there right from the beginning, and there's no avoiding it. And it's the militarization of the country, and it's just appalling. That's one of the things that I point out in the book.
Well, you've just hit the key here. And again, you were allowed into their very annals, the nexus from R.A.N.D to Ford. The Ford documents came out in the 77 hearings in Congress, and the right-wing media, Rush Limbaugh, all of them for decades, said no global government exists. Now they're forced to admit it because the world government's in the open, but they claim it's low-level communist professors.
Oh, please.
When the Pentagon created at Presidio the UN, the Pentagon created the plan for world government. Meanwhile, they've got all these right-wingers saying the Pentagon's fighting world government. They gave birth to this corporate world government. And you've got Tiny Tim Geithner, whose family was involved at the Ford Foundation, who is now the head of the Treasury.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's an old relationship. Not only that, and this is what I want to go back to what I mentioned before. I think they laid the theoretical foundation for this so that people would eventually accept it as being the right way to be.
Well, Alex, this is Bombshell. I want to tell folks how to get your book. And I really want to thank Tommy Pilata, who's met you and talked to you, for recommending you for the show, because just amazing on-spot, on-target research. We're going to come right back to you after the break so you can continue to discuss this. But I mean, they're the people charting and designing our world. Global corporate dictatorship.
Do you know